I woke up that morning excited to enjoy my backyard sanctuary, the singing birds, the soft rustle of leaves, and the majestic maple tree that had been there longer than I'd even owned the house. Little did I know, within days, my treasured tree would be gone, brutally cut down on the orders of an HOA Karen who thought she could control every inch of our neighborhood. And when I decided to fight back, I uncovered a jaw-dropping secret. This tree-hatting Karen had her hands deep in our HOA funds, siphoning money for her own personal gain. If you love stories of petty power struggles turned on their head, stick around, hit that like button, subscribe to Tailflow for more insane HOA showdowns, and don't forget to comment below if you've ever battled a power-hungry neighbor. Now, buckle up, because this is one wild ride. I've lived in this community for about 3 years, enough time to watch it evolve from a friendly neighborhood into a place ruled by an iron-fisted HOA. At the heart of this iron fist was Karen, our brand-new HOA president. From the moment she took office, she policed everything: mailbox colors, the height of your grass, even the type of flowers you planted in your front yard. She thrived on handing out notices, imposing fines, and hosting suspicious meetings that no one seemed to know about until after they'd already been held. Most of my neighbors lived in quiet resignation, figuring that as long as they kept their heads down, Karen would pass them over. But I guess my property was doomed to be her next power trip. The letter arrived on a Thursday, folded neatly and tucked under my doormat. At first glance, I assumed it was another generic reminder about trash bins, so I left it on my kitchen table without reading it. My wife, Bate, got home later and decided to crack it open, expecting typical HOA fluff. Instead, she found a grim demand. Pursuant to HOA landscaping standards, your tree has been deemed a violation of community guidelines. Immediate removal is required. The words "immediate removal" were underlined 3 times in bold ink. Bate, wide-eyed, handed me the letter. A knot twisted in my stomach. It felt absurd. We both loved that tree, a towering maple that provided much-needed shade during the scorching summer months and blazed in brilliant reds and oranges every fall. It had been part of the property for decades, and prior owners had cherished it too. Why was it all of a sudden an eyesore? I skimmed the rest of the notice, searching for a reason. All it said was that the aesthetic of the tree was not in line with newly implemented HOA guidelines. At that point, I realized something was fishy. The HOA guidelines we'd received when we bought the house said nothing about tree height or aesthetic concerns. Sure, there were rules about leaving your lawn unkempt or letting branches overhang a sidewalk, but this maple was healthy, well-pruned, and a neighborhood favorite. So how had it become a violation? The letter ended with a final paragraph. Failure to comply within 10 days will result in escalating fines, and potential legal action may be pursued by the HOA. It seemed Karen wanted to make an example out of us. I decided to march down to the HOA office at our neighborhood's community center the following morning. When I arrived, I found the place eerily quiet, like nobody wanted to be there. The receptionist, a timid woman named Linda, wore an apologetic expression when she saw me holding the letter. "You'll have to speak to Karen," she mumbled, then disappeared into a back office, leaving me to stew in my frustration. 5 minutes later, Karen emerged, chin raised, eyes narrow, as though she were bracing for a fight. "Can I help you?" Her voice had that clipped, condescending tone that instantly made my blood boil. "Yes," I said, holding up the notice. "I'd like to know why you're forcing me to remove a healthy tree from my backyard." She took the paper, skimmed it, and nodded as though everything was perfectly normal. "Yes, your maple was flagged for being above the permissible landscaping threshold. We're keeping the neighborhood uniform." She said uniform like it was the ultimate virtue. "We recently updated the standards at last month's HOA meeting." I frowned. I keep up with HOA announcements. I never saw anything about new landscaping standards. She shrugged, a plastic smile on her lips. "Well, you must have missed the memo. The board voted unanimously. Sorry if you weren't aware, but it's in effect now." Her eyes glinted with that smug satisfaction of someone who believed she had unchecked power. I suspected she was lying or exaggerating. She thrived on intimidation, expecting people to comply to avoid a fight, but I'd always been the type to stand my ground when something smelled fishy. "I plan to appeal," I said firmly, meeting her gaze. "That's a big change to spring on people out of nowhere." She gave me another plastic smile. "You're free to file an appeal, however, it won't change the outcome. Please keep in mind that if you fail to remove the tree, fines begin at $50 per day and could escalate quickly." At that point, my frustration mixed with a dose of anxiety. $50 a day wasn't chump change, and she threatened it could climb. I left that meeting convinced she singled us out for reasons I couldn't yet understand. Bate and I spent the next few days digging through every HOA newsletter, email, and update we could find from the past 6 months. We found no mention of any newly implemented landscaping guidelines. In fact, the last official rule set we had was from 2 years ago, well before Karen had become president. Meanwhile, the 10-day countdown ticked away. We considered ignoring the notice, but we worried about whether she actually had the power to tack on massive fines. Our property taxes and mortgage were enough of a financial burden without tacked-on fees from an overbearing HOA. About 5 days in, a neighbor named Carlos dropped by. He'd heard rumors that Karen was forcing us to cut down our maple. Turns out, Carlos had also butted heads with Karen. She'd fined him for having excessive yard decorations, which were actually just 2 garden gnomes nestled by his tulips. She'd also threatened to have his kids' trampoline removed for being unsightly. Carlos had done some digging of his own into Karen's background and discovered that she had a pattern of questionable tactics in her previous HOA position from another community. "I think she's a bully," he told us. "She thrives on intimidation. Most people cave to avoid a fight." But we both agreed caving would just embolden her further. I attempted to schedule a formal hearing with the HOA board. To my dismay, I got stonewalled at every turn. Linda, the receptionist, apologized profusely but said the next available board meeting was 3 months away, months after our compliance deadline. I realized Karen was rigging the system. That left me with 2 options, either remove the tree or risk daily fines. I began to wonder if she had some personal vendetta, had we offended her somehow. On the 8th day, 2 days before the deadline, I came home from work to find a small crowd gathered by my driveway. My heart hammered. Something felt off. Bate was out front, arms folded, fury etched on her face. Then I spotted the trunk of the maple tree, severed at the base, the rest lying in our yard like a fallen giant. A crew of workers, hired by the HOA, had come onto our property without warning and chopped it down. The stench of fresh sawdust hung heavy in the air. I marched up to them, demanding to know who authorized this. One worker muttered, "Karen," then hopped into his truck and sped off with the rest of the crew, leaving behind a mess of branches and a stump. The job had been done swiftly and, from the looks of it, with zero care for my personal property. I felt outrage and heartbreak twist together. That maple had been a living fixture of our home, a place we strung lights, set up a hammock, watched the leaves change color. Now it was sawdust and severed limbs. I couldn't believe Karen had stooped to blatant trespassing and destruction. The crowd of neighbors muttered curses about the HOA. Bate asked if we could sue. I said we'd definitely explore it, but we needed proof. Little did I know the story was only beginning. Because the very next morning, as I tried to figure out how to hold Karen accountable, I stumbled upon a clue that led me down a rabbit hole of epic proportions. How I found that clue would rattle the neighborhood, call the entire HOA into question, and lead to Karen's humiliating downfall. But first, I had to piece together the breadcrumbs that would reveal just how deep her corruption went. As it turned out, the first breadcrumb came from an unlikely source. An old flyer Bate found pinned to our fridge behind a stack of other papers. It advertised a community beautification fund that the HOA had launched a few months prior. According to the flyer, the association had set aside a special budget to make improvements around the neighborhood, like planting flowers, repainting park benches, and repairing sidewalks. We'd hardly paid attention to it at the time, but the moment we reread it, we realized something interesting. The flyer stated that the HOA had allocated a substantial sum for these improvements. Yet in the months since, we've seen zero results. No new flowers, no fresh paint, no improved sidewalks. So where did that money go? The next day, while rummaging through old emails, I found an even juicier tidbit, an HOA newsletter boasting about landscaping upgrades. I cross-referenced the details with actual observations in our neighborhood. No such upgrades existed, nor had they even been attempted. This set my mind racing. Could it be that Karen was funneling this so-called beautification fund into something else entirely? I approached Carlos and a few other neighbors who had also received suspicious fines or forced compliance notices from Karen. The stories were all too similar. No official rule changes, no transparency from the board, and no real improvements to show for the significant HOA dues we all paid. Meanwhile, Karen had apparently paid for a brand new fence around her property, supposedly for security reasons, which the HOA apparently approved with zero hassle. It clicked that maybe she was using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. Bates suggested we look at the HOA's financials. Typically, an association must keep records accessible to homeowners, so I marched back down to the HOA office, demanded to see the budget and expense reports, and quoted the relevant bylaw that gave residents the right to review such documents. Linda, looking pale, stammered that she'd have to check with Karen for permission. I insisted the bylaws didn't require the president's permission, just that the documents be made available to members in good standing. After some back and forth, Linda finally handed over a thick binder of financial statements. "Please don't let Karen know I gave you this," she whispered. I took the binder home, spread everything across our kitchen table, and started combing through the spreadsheets. In an early section, I found the usual expenses: utility bills for streetlights, funds for the community pool's upkeep, and minor administrative costs. Then near the end, there was a suspicious line item called beautification and landscaping. Next to it was an exorbitant figure, tens of thousands of dollars allocated. But in the project details column, the space was blank or filled with vague references like maintenance. Bate and I looked at each other, baffled. That was a huge chunk of money with no specifics. We cross-referenced the months and saw that the same amount was being spent consistently, with no breakdown of who or what was receiving it. This was definitely a red flag. We decided to dig deeper. Over the following days, we rummaged through every HOA communication, looking for any sign of a vendor, contractor, or invoice. Eventually, Bate discovered a single mention of landscaping services by Maple Sky Co. in an older monthly statement. We both nearly laughed, Maple Sky Co. for landscaping, after Karen forced us to chop down our beloved maple. More importantly, Maple Sky Co. didn't ring a bell. We asked neighbors if they'd seen any landscaping vehicles with that logo. Not one person had. We tried to find Maple Sky Co. online. Nothing. No website, no business registration with the state, no phone listing. At that point, we realized we had the smoking gun. Karen was possibly inventing a phantom landscaping company as an excuse to siphon HOA funds. But to confirm, we needed more tangible proof. At the next opportunity, I returned the binder to Linda at the HOA office, asking if there were any invoices or receipts for Maple Sky Co. She hesitated. "I'm not sure we keep them here." Her voice trailed off. She realized she'd said too much. Sensing a chance, I pressed, "So you've never seen an invoice from Maple Sky Co.?" She bit her lip, shook her head. "No, sorry, that's all I can say." Linda's fear told me everything I needed to know. Karen was either intimidating staff into silence or running this scheme entirely behind closed doors. The more I thought about it, the more furious I became. She'd forcibly cut down my tree and threatened me with fines, all while she was apparently stealing from the very people she claimed to protect from aesthetic hazards. Over the next week, I quietly gathered statements from neighbors who suspected wrongdoing. I compiled all the anomalies, suspicious expenses, non-existent improvements, hammered out claims that Maple Sky Co. was paid large sums, plus the personal stories of intimidation. Our group reached out to the rest of the HOA board. We discovered a crucial fact. Karen had basically stacked the board with people who hardly attended meetings or who always voted her way. Real decisions weren't happening in open sessions. Everything was done out of the public eye, which explained the sudden rule about my tree and the ease with which Karen spent thousands without accountability. I wasn't sure how best to blow this open. Some neighbors thought we should call a lawyer or contact local authorities. Others worried we lacked enough concrete proof. Then a stroke of luck came our way. An anonymous tip landed in my email inbox. The message said, "Ask about the Oak Hill project. Karen never completed it." This Oak Hill project was apparently another capital improvement plan from last year, also with a hefty budget. We'd never seen any mention of it in official newsletters, nor any sign of it in the neighborhood. This was possibly another big pot of money that disappeared under Karen's watch. At this point, we had multiple strands of evidence, but we needed to tie them together in a public setting. The real question was how to get an audience for it. Since Karen had locked down the official HOA channels, we decided to schedule our own community meeting at a local library's event room. We posted notices on Nextdoor and social media, emailing every neighbor we could. The flyer read, "Is our HOA being used like a personal bank? Join us for an open discussion." We decided to hold it on a Saturday afternoon, hoping to attract a decent crowd. Of course, we didn't invite Karen or her cronies. The day of the meeting, we arrived early to set up chairs and a projector. I felt a knot of nerves in my gut. How many neighbors would show up? Would they even believe us? Then, about half an hour before the meeting, residents started pouring in, some out of sheer curiosity, others because they had their own grudges against Karen. Within 15 minutes, the room was almost standing room only. I recognized Carlos and Linda near the back, trying to keep a low profile. People whispered about how Karen would react if she found out. Taking a breath, I stepped to the front and introduced myself. I explained how Karen had singled me out by demanding I remove my maple tree, then forcibly cut it down. I talked about how this spurred me to examine the HOA budget, leading me to suspicious line items like Maple Sky Co. Then I clicked to a slide showing the monthly payments going out to that non-existent company. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. One older woman exclaimed, "So that's why my HOA dues went up this year." Another neighbor cursed under his breath, lamenting that the community pool had been closed for repairs for months, with no actual repairs done. The puzzle pieces started clicking into place for everyone. I then unveiled the Oak Hill project, which was supposed to cost tens of thousands for some improvement or other, but had produced zero results. More angry whispers. People were outraged at the idea that we all been paying inflated dues only for Karen to stash the money away. Linda quietly stepped up, voice trembling as she admitted that she'd seen bits of evidence but was afraid to speak. She apologized, tears in her eyes, saying she never meant to let it go this far. In that moment, the crowd's anger shifted from generalized frustration to calls for action. They wanted justice. We decided to call an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. While it wasn't an official HOA board meeting, the wave of consensus was overwhelming. Everyone demanded an official audit of the HOA finances. They wanted to gather outside attorneys and have the city's Better Business Bureau or local government investigate potential fraud. A few longtime residents who had once supported Karen looked shell-shocked. They realized she'd manipulated them under the guise of neighborhood pride. To our surprise, halfway through the meeting, Karen herself burst into the room. She wore an expression of righteous fury, a manila folder clutched under her arm. I guess she'd gotten word about our gathering. The room went quiet. She stormed up to the front, pointing her finger. "How dare you hold an unauthorized meeting about the HOA?" Her voice shook with rage. She tried to accuse me of slandering her name, but the crowd had seen the evidence. A few neighbors shouted for her to explain Maple Sky Co. Another demanded an explanation for the Oak Hill project. The manila folder in her hand trembled as she clutched it. She insisted everything was accounted for, that we were twisting facts. But she couldn't produce a single invoice or receipt. It was all bluster. As tension escalated, I calmly repeated the question. "So show us the receipts for Maple Sky Co. or the Oak Hill project. If you can prove we're lying, let's see it." She opened her folder, rummaged through papers, and produced half-filled spreadsheets with no official letterheads or signatures. People started booing. She shouted something about how this was all a misunderstanding, that her name was being smeared for political reasons. But the crowd wasn't buying it. For the first time, Karen looked genuinely rattled. She stormed out, calling the entire thing a witch hunt. Over the next 2 weeks, the community braced itself. We'd called for an emergency HOA board meeting to address the allegations. Under normal circumstances, Karen would have tried to block it, but the outcry was so loud that the rest of the board realized ignoring it would be suicide. On the night of the meeting, the rec center was packed beyond capacity. Neighbors who rarely left their homes in the evening came out just to see how this drama would unfold. Karen sat at the front table with the other board members. She wore a tight-lipped expression as though she were already on trial. People began peppering the board with questions about finances. The board members stammered, claiming they'd left budget management mostly to Karen. She had them sign off on half-baked summaries, apparently never giving them the full data. Karen tried to bulldoze the conversation, blaming incompetent subcontractors or clerical errors. But the evidence we provided was thorough. We had official checks, finance logs, and Linda's testimony. The final blow came when a local investigative reporter who'd gotten wind of the fiasco stood up and announced that he'd found no record of Maple Sky Co. in the state's business registry. The room erupted. Karen's face drained of color. She had no plausible excuse. That's all it took. The board turned on her. They voted to remove her as president on the spot. The new interim president said they'd be launching a full forensic audit and turning over their findings to the authorities. Karen, humiliated, grabbed her purse and stormed out without a word while the crowd parted like the Red Sea. In the aftermath, we discovered that Karen had pocketed tens of thousands of dollars, forging documents to make it look legitimate. Investigators from the local government took statements from multiple residents, and rumor had it Karen was facing possible civil suits. Meanwhile, the new HOA leadership apologized profusely for letting her run wild. Neighbors found relief in the knowledge that their dues would now actually go toward community improvements. Some folks even approached me with tearful thanks, saying they'd suspected wrongdoing but never had the courage or evidence to speak up. The best part, though, was that a few days after Karen was booted, I received a knock at the door. An official from the city explained that the maple tree had been cut down illegally. No permit was filed to remove a large tree, which was required by local ordinance if the tree was healthy. While it was too late to bring the tree back, the city slapped the HOA with a violation for trespassing and unapproved removal. The new president promised to reimburse me for the stump grinding and offered to plant another sapling if we so wished. Bait and I accepted, although it wouldn't replace our beloved maple overnight. Still, it felt like a moral victory that even the city recognized the wrongdoing. Strangely enough, I heard Karen eventually sold her house and left the neighborhood, presumably to avoid the humiliating aftermath of her fiasco. We never saw her again. The rumor mill said she might have had to repay a hefty chunk of money and faced legal consequences, but we never got the final details. We simply returned to normal life, minus our once beautiful maple, but plus a profound sense of relief and renewed community spirit. Neighbors became friendlier, less guarded. People started hosting block parties again, and the board functioned with actual transparency. In the end, Karen's attempts to control our yards exposed her own criminal scheme, and that ironically brought the neighborhood closer together. Bate and I occasionally stand by the stump where our mighty maple once reigned. It's bittersweet. We miss its shade and autumn colors, but we also know that its sacrifice led us to uncover Karen's corruption. If that tree hadn't been singled out, who knows how long she would have embezzled funds. Life sometimes works in twisted ways like that. One wrong leads to another truth. So while we grieve the tree, we also cherish the sense of justice that came with its downfall. It's funny how losing something can make you gain so much more, like a renewed appreciation for fairness, an awakened sense of community among neighbors, and the satisfaction of taking down a crooked HOA president who thought she was untouchable. And that, my friends, is the story of how Karen cut down my precious backyard tree, only for me to discover she was illegally tapping into our HOA's funds all along. She wanted to control my yard. Well, I made sure she lost her entire position instead. Thank you for sticking around to hear every twist and turn of this wild HOA showdown. If you enjoyed this story of petty power plays leading to epic comeuppance, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Taleflow for more unbelievable neighborhood sagas, and drop a comment below if you've ever had a neighbor who thought they could get away with everything. Because sometimes all it takes is one little spark, or in my case, one chopped down tree, to ignite the truth and take down a neighborhood tyrant.